Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to In Search of Meaning, an exciting journey through archaeology in the Bible to discover meaning for our lives here in the 20th century. We're glad you're here. We hope you had a good week off. And can you sense that fall is finally in the air? Yes, indeed. Well, we're so glad that you've joined us again and back with us in our new time here at 6:30. We have an exciting subject tonight. Our presenter will speak on secrets that only a mummy can tell. And so it's going to be an exciting topic. But you also want to be sure to be back tomorrow evening. Tomorrow evening at 6:30, we're going to be looking at the truth about the Shroud of Turin. And so that also will be a wonderful subject. If you've come in and you've joined us, remember that at the registration table to stop there, drop your ticket, or register as the case may be, so you can enter a chance for the nightly drawing. Also at this time, we'll ask if you have any mobile devices, if you would do us the wonderful favor of silencing them for the comfort of those around you and for the sake of the recording. We would greatly appreciate that. We're so glad you're here. I know that Frank Zolman is glad you're here as well. Please help me welcome our speaker and presenter, Dr. Frank Zolman.
Good evening. I promised you a story. Has my wife made it in here yet? There she is. I promised them a story. I forgot to tell you this. Please come. And all you women are saying, boy, I'm glad I'm not married to that guy. So, when I was able to, there's no one there. When I was able, I came home one afternoon about 25 years ago, and I had made a brand new purchase of an artifact. And I was very excited.
Very excited.
Yeah. There we go. We're on. So I was very excited. And it was the mummified bird that is out in the foyer, in the cabinet. Some of you have seen it. If you haven't seen it, make sure you look at it on the way out. I was excited, right?
You were excited.
Yeah, very excited.
Now you have to remember, he kept bringing home stuff. And he kept bringing home pieces of pottery, and he'd say, "Oh, look at this." And I'd say, "Oh, it looks just like the other 10 you have in your cabinet." Okay, so I'm not a real big appreciator. I support, but I don't necessarily appreciate.
So I was so excited, and what was your response?
Well, he takes this box, and he says, "You're not going to believe what I have." Okay. And he very carefully pulls back, kind of dramatically, because, if you haven't noticed, he has a flair for the dramatic. And he just pulls back the wrappings one by one, and his eyes are just glazed over. And he says, "Look." And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "It is a mummified falcon from which period?
Probably from the late kingdom.
From the late kingdom." And I go, "Oh, nice." And he said, well, you don't seem very excited." And I said, "Why would I be excited to have a dead bird in my house?" And he just kind of deflated. I've tried to be supportive and do better since then, but sometimes I don't.
But it has become known as the dead bird in the house. But 2 years ago, my wife and I were traveling overseas, and we were getting our wills all in order before we left. And so my wife got on FaceTime with both of our children and walked around the whole house and looked at objects in the house, and each child would say, "I want that in the will, I want that in the will." And my daughter says she wants
the dead bird.
Yeah. So my daughter will inherit that. And then there was just a little bit more story. Then there was the time in Philadelphia when I was doing this lecture series. I was just developing it. I think it's the first time I ever did this lecture on mummies. And I was getting ready to do it. And she was looking in my office for some literature, a book to give someone. She went into my closet in my office.
And I'm looking in boxes, right?
Opening boxes.
Looking in boxes. It's kind of a dark, creepy closet anyway. And I open up this box, and here's this mummified foot of a human being in his closet. It was a little shocking.
And a hand.
Oh, and a hand. Yeah, I forgot there were both. But there's like mummified body parts in the closet.
So those
at
are the
church.
skeletons in my closet.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay, well, you had to hear those stories. I told you I'd have a couple mummy stories. I had borrowed those mummified body parts from someone who was a dealer, and she was kind enough to let me borrow them. So anyway, those are my mummy stories. Lots of people know about mummies. There are lots of jokes going around about mummies, lots of riddles, like what did King Tut say when he was afraid? "I want my mummy." Oh, but where do mummies go for a swim? To the Dead Sea. Yeah. Why were the ancient Egyptian children confused? Because their daddies were mummies. Now that almost sounds contemporary, doesn't it? There are lots of jokes about mummies. Mummies have been very popular in movies through the years. Many mummy movies have been made. The first original one was 1932, and then the big famous one in recent times was 1999, and there have been sequels. In the 1940s, Lon Chaney Jr., some of you will have seen some of these old classic movies. He made 3 movies about the mummy. 1955, Abbott and Costello meet the mummy. And you'll recognize Bud Abbott. I'm sorry, this is Lou Costello, famous archaeologist. So perhaps mummies are the only second most typically Egyptian object. Perhaps only the pyramids beat it. The word mummy comes from the word mumia. It's a Greek word which means bitumen or something preserved by bitumen. And bitumen is like tar. And so the word mumia became to us mummy. In modern usage, it is a body of an animal or a human that has been embalmed by the ancient Egyptians or by some similar method of burial. Now, most of the time we think of human mummies, but in actual fact, they mummified all kinds of animals: birds, dog, cat, lots of cat mummies. They mummified fish, monkeys. The one on the bottom is a mummified crocodile. And then the bull was a sacred animal, the Apis bull, and they had a whole mausoleum full of these mummified Apis bulls. And so it wasn't just humans. And in fact, it's not just Egypt, because there are mummies from all around the world. Here's a mummy from Denmark called Tolland Man. He was ritually sacrificed. There's a rope around his neck. He was ritually sacrificed and put in a bog. And something about the tannin in the bogs preserves the skin unbelievably. You also have mummies in Peru, up in the high mountainous regions. Here's a little baby mummy. The southwest United States, you have naturally occurring mummies. From Melanesia and China, this is just stark and remarkable. And then in Hungary, these are all naturally occurring mummies. And then this haunting one from Greenland. Very, very fascinating. So there are mummies from all the way around the world. But most of us, when we think about mummies, most of us think about Egypt. And so people have long been fascinated by Egyptian mummies. In the 16th century, a mummy had an interesting use. They actually were taking mummified bodies and grinding them up into powder and taking them as medicine. Why would anyone do that? Because tar or bitumen had long been considered by medieval doctors remedy for various diseases. And so when people saw these Egyptian mummies, they looked like they had been cured in tar. And so someone thought, well, let's grind up a mummy and take that as medication. And so that's what they did. There's a traveler from Leipzig who visited, his name's John Helfrich, who visited Egypt in 1565. And he was so anxious to buy some mummies that he dug the sand out of several tombs searching for ancient mummies. But then there was another guy named John Sanderson who worked for the Turkey Company, who spent a whole year in Egypt from 1585 to 1586. And he visited all over the place, but he spent most of his time digging in the Memphis mummy pits. And there he bought more than 600 pounds of mummified flesh and sent it to England just for people to grind up and make it into medicine. He had to do some serious bribing to get these mummies out of Egypt. The French physician Guy de La Fontaine investigated the mummy trade in Alexandria in 1564, and he found clear evidence that because there was such a demand for ground up mummy flesh, that they couldn't find enough ancient Egyptian mummies to satisfy the need, and so they began to go to modern graveyards and dig up corpses of people that had been dead from recent times. No one really cared about the source of the mummy. I think I would have, don't you? But the Arabs wondered that Christians who were so particular about their diet would actually eat the mummies, the bodies of dead mummies. I don't blame them. It's said that King Francis I of France carried a small package of mummy with him as an emergency precaution. Well, you can imagine that the Egyptian government did everything they could to stamp out the trade in mummies. However, where there's a demand, there's always the black market. And apparently also, it's interesting that ships that were carrying mummies out of Egypt and into the Mediterranean Sea often crashed. And so there was, amongst the sailors, there was this talk about the curse of the mummy. And so they didn't want to take mummies out of Egypt. Even in Mark Twain's day, Mark Twain writes about mummies in his book, Innocents Abroad. And of course, this is not true, but he quips that the fuel they use for the locomotive is composed of mummies 3,000 years old, purchased by the ton or by the graveyard for that purpose. And sometimes one hears the profane engineer call out pettishly, "Darn these plebeians, they don't burn worth a cent. Pass out a king." That's what Mark Twain's take on it was. It is said that even in New York City during the 1970s, it was possible to buy powdered mummy at some of the black market shops. Well, first, why mummify dead people? Why even do this? Well, at the very outset, I want to state to you that mummification was not a preoccupation with death. Some people have thought that. But mummification was a preoccupation with the life to come. Because the body had to be prepared for the life to come. And all the tomb offerings had to be in the tomb so that for the person who came to the life to come, if it was in the tomb, then he'd have it in the life to come. And so that's why they buried all these things. And so it was a preparation for the life to come. So the purpose of mummification was to guarantee effective function in the life to come. And by careful preservation of the body and its essential organs, it was concluded that the normal function of life would continue in the life to come. Now, what they believed was that the physical appearance had to be as close as possible in death to how the person looked in life. In Egyptian language, the body was called the ka. There was another part of man called the ba. And Christians today, some Christians would probably call the ba the spirit. And so when a person died, the ba left the body and made various journeys. And the Egyptians had this whole book that described the journeys that the ba had to make. And this is called the Book of the Dead. And there were spells in the Book of the Dead so that when the ba met the wicked snake trying to cross the river, there was a spell in the Book of the Dead that enabled him to get across the river. And so the ba has to make these various and numerous journeys. But it is important that when the ba comes back to the ka, the body, it's important that the ba will be able to recognize himself. And so that is why the Egyptians wanted to mummify. So here's a guy named Seti the First. And here he is mummified. When I was in the Egyptian Museum, I've studied this so many times. When I was in the Egyptian Museum a few years ago, I found it interesting to go into the mummy room and recognize all the mummies without reading the tags. It's like they're old friends. And this is Seti the First. Now I want you to see how Seti's body looks in conjunction with an actual carving of him. You can see that, the preservation is very, very good. Now, the idea of mummification probably came from what we call pre-dynastic burials. These were burials that happened before 3100 BC. And usually at that point in time, the bodies were just buried in a hole in the sand, and they are remarkably preserved. It's quite amazing how remarkably preserved they are, which would tell you, and by the way, these are not embalmed whatsoever. These bodies were just wrapped in baskets or in linen and just dumped in the hole, always in the fetal position. So this should begin to give you some insight into the fact that it wasn't necessarily mummification that preserved the ancient Egyptians as well as they were preserved, as much as it was their environment. These pre-dynastic burials are incredibly preserved because when the bodies were placed in the dry sand, the sand just literally sucked up the fluid out of their bodies, the water, before it had a chance to putrefy. So what I want to describe to you in the next few minutes is the process of mummification. Now, most of what we know about mummification we have learned by observation. There are no ancient papyri which talks about how to mummify a person. There is no mummification for dummies in the ancient world. There are no papyri, no writings that tell how to mummify a person. But it seems to have changed very little over the years. And so that historian Herodotus, the Greek tourist that we've talked about before, about 330 BC, he visited Egypt and he witnessed some mummification. And so he writes about mummification in his writings. And it's very interesting. He says there were a set of men who were known as embalmers, and it was their job to mummify people. When the body was brought, the bearers were shown various models of corpses made in wood and painted so to look like a mummy. So they have model people, and they have 3 different types. Perfect, like Osiris himself, or a middle quality, or a basic quality. So you had 3 choices. Now, I don't know how many of you have had to go to a funeral home and make preparations for burying a dead person, a loved one, but it's very similar to what they do today. Well, you want this cheap casket or you want this expensive casket. And so, of course, whether or not the mummy looked like Osiris himself or whether it was basic depended upon how much were you willing to spend. And as I say, it hasn't changed over the years. And so when Herodotus was there, this is during what we call the New Kingdom period, he describes the 13 steps used in mummification. When I was living in Philadelphia, PA, I was developing this series on archaeology in the Bible, and the first time I ever spoke this lecture, I had in the audience a funeral director whose name was Alvin Wetzel from Philadelphia. And Alvin came up to me afterwards and told me the Egyptians did it right because they did the exact steps that needed to be done to preserve the body. And the most important part, he said, was to get rid of the moisture, which is why those pre-dynastic burials worked so well. And so the first step is the body of the deceased is taken to the place of mummification as soon as possible after the death. The clothing was removed. The body was placed on a work table for the succeeding processes. And archaeologists have actually found a number of tables like this, which it seems very plain that these were embalming tables. You see at the head end, there was a reservoir for catching bodily fluids, to put it in a delicate way. So archaeologists have found what they believe are to be the embalming tables. The first, after bringing the body and getting it ready, the first real intrusion into the body was to remove the brain. The brain has huge amounts of moisture in it, and so they knew that they had to get rid of the brain. And so they did this with a technique of opening a hole up in the nasal cavity. So they went through the nostril, up into the nasal cavity, and broke through the nasal cavity into the skull. And it was through that they pushed a hook. This is a reconstruction or a modern replica. And archaeologists thought for many years that they used this hook to pull the brain out. Now, this is pretty graphic, I understand, but that's what archaeologists believe. There's an Egyptologist whose name is Bob Breyer, who has performed on a human body a modern mummification. And when he tried this step, it simply didn't work because the brain would not stick to the hook and pull out. It wasn't stringy enough or whatever. And so what Bob Breyer ended up doing was using the hook kind of like a whisk that you would use for whipping eggs. And then he turned the body over and the fluid of the brain drained out through the nostrils. But it had to be done. It had to be done. Now, I find it fascinating that of all the body parts, each one is cared for carefully besides the brain. The brain was the only thing that was discarded in the mummification process. Why? Because they did not know what the brain was for. They believed that the seat of our emotions was in our hearts and in our intestines. And so they did not know what the brain was for, and so the brain was simply discarded. And you might wonder, why did they think the emotions were in the heart and in the intestines? It's because when people get scared, what happens? Their heart starts beating. Or people get feeling like they're in love, you get this feeling in your heart. Or when people get angry, they say something, you can get so angry that you get a stomach ache. And so they believed that the seat of emotions was there. It's also a biblical idea, by the way, too. After the brain was disposed of, they made a cut in the abdomen, an incision, usually on the left side, but it can be found in other places as well. The abdominal organs were extracted, except for the kidneys, but sometimes they were also taken. The diaphragm was cut out, and the contents of the thorax, except the heart and the aorta, were removed. Although every once in a while they removed the heart also and put a big, huge scarab up where the heart was. It was differing things during differing periods. Archaeologists have also, again, identified knives and flints that they believe were used for this process. After the cleansing, after the removal of the internal organs, step number 4, the thorax and the abdomen were cleansed, probably with palm wine. And the purpose of the palm wine was to disinfect. They understood disinfecting. Whether or not they understood germs or not, they understood the wine would disinfect that cavity. Now, the viscera, or the liver, stomach, lungs, and intestines, were separated and cleaned and dried, and they were, interestingly enough, mummified separately. And so in Egyptian tombs, you find a set of 4 what are called canopic jars. I have the lid of one out in the foyer in the Egyptian cabinet. I was going to bring them up and show them to you from up here, but I thought it would be better off to leave them there so you can see them close up. So I decided to leave them actually in the display back there. These canopic jars can be very fascinating, very, very beautiful. That was full of someone's internal body parts. And then here's this one from Tutankhamun's tomb. This is the lid of one of his canopic jars. Those body parts were treated with molten resin, just like the body, wrapped in separate linen packages, and then placed in these canopic jars. After this step, the thorax and abdomen were stuffed with temporary packing material to make sure that the body would be totally desiccated, totally dried of all the water, the fluids. And it was this step in stuffing the body cavity full of some kind of stuffing material, whether it be old linens or onions or all kinds of strange things. It was this step when they started the drying process that allowed the abdominal cavity not to cave in too far, because it was now empty. At this point in time, they would start the desiccation of the entire body. And this was done with a salt called natron. Now, it's interesting that as we're going through this to realize that we have in the Bible an evidence of this happening. In the book of Genesis, we have Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel, or Jacob. So Jacob was actually treated like this. He became a mummy. They desiccated the bodies, or dried the bodies out, with a salt called natron. It can be gathered in huge quantities. It's a naturally occurring salt in Egypt. And they would cover the whole body with this natron. And it had the effect of removing any liquids and fluids that were still there. The drying out process lasted 40 days. So for 40 days, they would be covered with this natron, sucking out the fluids from the body. After the drying out process, the temporary packing material would be removed, and then resin or tar, or whatever you want to call it, impregnated cloth would then be placed in the abdomen and usually in the cranium. We see this in x-rays of ancient mummies. The body cavities were stuffed now permanently with linen cloth, bags of other materials like natron, sawdust, earth, and then, as I said, occasionally a few onions. Why onions? I have no idea. They just seem to like onions. The incision was closed with resin or wax or linen, and it was usually covered with a little plate of metal. The embalming incision is found sometimes where it's stitched together. The body was anointed with fragrant materials, and then oftentimes the face was packed with wax or resin-soaked linen, and pads of linen were placed over the eyeballs. Now, this is a particularly interesting mummy. This is Ramses III. And if any of you watched any of those early movies that I was talking about, I don't necessarily recommend you sit your children down tomorrow night and watch them. But this is actually the Lon Chaney movies. This is actually the mummy they patterned him after. So if you watch those movies, he will look a lot like Ramses III. Liquid resin was smeared all over the body, and in essence, they were trying to seal the body so nothing could come in from the outside, and also to strengthen the skin. But this is what gave the body the brown look, that mummified, distinctive color. Amulets, number 13. Amulets and other jewelry were placed on the mummy. The amount and quality were depended upon, of course, how wealthy the person who was being mummified was. They were considered to be good luck charms. These are some particularly powerful amulets called the Eye of Horus. This is an amulet of Anubis. And here you can see an x-ray of an Egyptian mummy. And there you see, I told you they sometimes put a big scarab in place of the heart. They've done that with this mummy. And then they put these amulets and wrap them into the mummy itself. And then finally was the wrapping of the mummy. It was wrapped in linen bandages, and sometimes as they did the wrapping, they would put this resin again, tar, bitumen, whatever you want to call it, between the layers, and so oftentimes when it dried out, the body would be kind of hard. The most complex wrapping began with the individual fingers and toes, and then proceeded to the limbs, and ultimately encased the total corpse in layers of linen. Sometimes masks were put on. You can see how much linen was used on this mummy. This mummy is happened to have been unwrapped in the late 1800s. In the late 1800s, people who had a lot of money would oftentimes go visit Egypt. It was something called the Grand Tour. And oftentimes they would buy mummies to bring back to eat, especially to England. And then on Saturday night, they would invite all of their friends over to the mummy unwrapping. And that's what they did. So I said they put masks on them. You can see out in the case out there are 3 masks that might have been wrapped on a mummy. And then after it was all said and done, they said these magic words. Okay, folks, that's a wrap. Then the mummies were taken and buried in nesting coffins or sarcophagi. The word sarcophagi in Greek is a compound word which means flesh eater. Sarx is the word for flesh. So the word sarcophagus is Greek for flesh eater. Oftentimes they nested several coffins together, the outside ones being quite spectacular, and then oftentimes the most outer part being of stone. And here you can see the progression of different coffins that would have gone together. They were buried with other burial goods that they would be needing in the life to come, and among them would be hundreds of what are called ushabti, or also called shawabtis. There are a number of them in the case out there for you to look at, and these were servants of the dead. In the Book of the Dead, there's actually a spell that was said over these that in essence said, "O answerer, in the life to come, when I am called upon to do work, you do it." And it sounds pretty good to me, right? Some of you would like to have them in your house today. I think we call those kids, don't we? Children, do this for me. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Ushabtis on another night when we talk about King Tut. Now, there have been fascinating discoveries made as they have investigated ancient mummies, and there is a field called paleopathology. Pathology, we still have pathologists today, but paleopathology is the study of disease of men and animals from ancient sources like mummies. So what they are modern detectives looking at ancient evidence. It's really quite fascinating, and mummies fall in here. Paleopathologists have performed a tremendous feat to ferret out so much information. So what they've discovered is, why did Egyptians die? What killed the ancient Egyptians? And there's this fascinating text that we find in the book of Exodus. Now, the book of Exodus, in Exodus 15, they are just freshly out of Egypt. And God gives them a promise. He says, if you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Now, this is the time of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. And God says that if they will obey his commands, he won't bring upon them the diseases that the Egyptians were suffering from. Now, what does the text mean? Does it mean supernatural protection? I think probably so. But I think it could also mean cause and effect. Because in the instructions that God gives his people, the Jews, the Hebrews, in those instructions are some very, very important and very exacting rules about how we should treat our bodies, about what we should eat and what we should drink. And those aren't just there because God wanted to be a party pooper and wanted them not to have anything fun and good to eat. Those were there to protect them. You see, we are individuals who are made up of different parts. We have the physical part. We have the mental. We have the social aspects of our lives and the spiritual aspects of our lives. And these are intertwined. You'll read in the literature today the word holistic, W-H-O-L-I-S-T-I-C, holistic. God knew that we're holistic. I know you've all experienced this when you've got a bad cold or you got the flu and somebody says, here, read this, and I can't understand the word it says. You've had that happen, right? Or your mental capacities, you don't feel good, you get in a bad mood, and that affects the social capacities, because then someone tries to get you to do something and you snap at them. We are holistic, and God's mostly concerned about our physical and mental well-being because he understood that it affects our spiritual well-being. I have that problem when I'm sick. Sometimes I'll try to have my devotions in the morning, and it's just like I just can't get it. God can't speak to me when I'm feeling so crummy. And so we are holistic people. And God says, I will not bring on you any of these diseases of the ancient Egyptians. So here's the question. What did God tell them to help prevent this? And how was the Mosaic Code used to prevent these diseases? And here's an interesting question. How do the diseases of antiquity compare with modern day diseases? Well, I'm convinced that the Bible has a lot to say about how we should care for our bodies. And I'm convinced that the Old Testament Mosaic health code is still relevant today. And it could be very helpful in the times in which we live. So I want to look at some mummies from the New Kingdom period, which is, I believe, the period of Moses being in Egypt, leaving Egypt. So during this period, archaeologists and paleopathologists have done a huge amount of study on mummies from the New Kingdom period. Dr. Rosalie David of Manchester, England, have autopsied dozens of mummies very carefully, as if they were autopsying a modern human body, very careful to try to ferret out the details. Also, there's a dentist by the name of James Harris and an Egyptologist by the name of Kent Woods, who have x-rayed many, many, many mummies. This is the head of Tutmosis I, and here is an x-ray of Tutmosis I. And they have found out through the x-rays and through the autopsies much of what actually killed them. And the CAT scans. Here's the CAT scan of a head. And then they have taken that information and done facial reconstruction. So on the right-hand side there, you're kind of looking at the face of an ancient Egyptian boy. Quite striking, quite fascinating. Well, as archaeologists and paleopathologists have looked at these mummies, they find something very interesting about what's called the Old Kingdom mummies. These are the most ancient mummies, dating to about 2000 BC. Or earlier. This is the time of the pyramid builders. They discovered that in these early dynasties, they do not find the diseases of later Egyptian civilizations. Their early diet during this period was largely vegetarian, not necessarily because they were trying to be health conscious, but because food and meat was hard to come by. And so they would only eat meat sparingly because they could not afford it or they could not get it. The people worked hard and displayed remarkable health. This is the mummy of a pharaoh whose name was Nefer. The autopsy and the x-ray of this mummy showed no apparent diseases, no tooth decay. That's fascinating to me. No tooth decay, and no arthritis. We compare Nefer to a man named Amenhotep. This is the 18th dynasty. He's generally the time of Moses. And he was studied by x-ray. His mummy is just beautiful. They didn't actually autopsy this one because they didn't want to cut open the wrappings. And so they've done extensive x-rays and of his full body, and they discovered that he had many health problems. They began to see the difference in lifestyle. It was a higher meat diet. The wealthy people basically did no work because they had servants and slaves to do all of that. They were eating more refined sugar and bread. Here's our friend Seti. I showed you Seti earlier. He was the first ruler of the 19th dynasty. X-rays revealed that his mouth was full of cavities. He was missing teeth. He had arthritis and other health problems. Here's Ramses II. Now, Ramses II was also from the 19th dynasty. He lived well past the age of 70. He was the longest lived and longest reigning pharaoh of all of ancient Egypt. He's also called Ramses the Great, and he is responsible for like half of the monuments that you go to ancient Egypt for. When you see them, this is a monument called Abu Simbel. Have any of you ever been to Abu Simbel? I want to go. I've not been there. But Ramses II, also called Ramses the Great, was responsible for building Abu Simbel. It's also deceiving because this guy I like to listen to named Bob Breyer, he has a nickname for Ramses the Great. He calls him Ramses the Great Chiseler. which means that Ramses never saw never saw a monument he couldn't put his name on. I've always thought that was funny. Somebody else built a monument, Ramses comes along, chisels their name out and puts his name on it. And then one day the god comes to his monument to look things over, and he says, "Oh, I thought Merneptah built this for me. I must be mistaken." He must have thought the gods were stupid. So Ramses the Great, when they examined his mummy, they found his mouth full of cavities, arthritis, arteriosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, and they concluded that by the time he died, he was very senile. And he was 70 at that time, and 70 in the ancient world in Egypt was very old. Very, very old. Here's a guy named Merneptah. He's also the 19th dynasty. He was very obese. His back teeth were missing. He had periodontal disease. He had cavities. He had a broken hip, degenerative arthritis, and arteriosclerosis also. And they actually did sections of his arteries and found that they were just covered with plaque. Here's husband and wife, Uya and Tuya. They are also from the time of the Exodus. They had severe arthritis and dental disease. And oftentimes, mummies like these showed cirrhosis of the liver because of a heavy use of alcoholic beverages. And then this is about Hatshepsut. I talked about Hatshepsut our first night here. This is the woman I believe to be the stepmother of Moses. She became a female pharaoh. This is a sphinx of Hatshepsut. It's interesting that Hatshepsut was not a queen. She was a king of Egypt. And she didn't have hormone problems growing a beard. It's a false beard, and she tied it on just like many of the men would. Well, she had many health problems also. She had arthritis, diabetes, bad teeth, and it actually is believed she died of bone cancer. And they don't find a lot of cancer in the ancient world, but they believe she died of bone cancer. The records tell us that the wealthy people during this time, it's the New Kingdom period, the records tell us that the wealthy people of the upper class lived life and imposed no restrictions upon themselves in regard to food, drink, and other pleasures. The poor, working class Egyptians were dying of work-related diseases and accidents and parasitic diseases, lung diseases from the smoke of fire and lamps and dust from working in the tombs. Very venomous snakes were also a hazard. And there are records of people being killed by stampeding hippos and snapping crocodiles. This is the way the poor working class people died. So this is the bad news. Egyptians suffered from many lifestyle diseases: atherosclerosis, heart disease, obesity, cancer, tooth decay, venereal disease, diabetes, arthritis, and a host of other diseases. Do these diseases sound familiar? This is what people are dying from today. So how is it that we have this same cycle going on? Because most of these are lifestyle diseases. This is what's killing Americans today. And I go back to that text that said that God will not put upon the Israelites the diseases of the Egyptians. How would those be prevented? Well, they were dying of heart disease and atherosclerosis. Here's a text from Leviticus 3:17. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come wherever you live. You must not eat any fat or any blood. Fat content. Does that sound like anything doctors are talking about today? Fatty foods, fatty meats. Here's another one. In Leviticus 11, say to the Israelites, of all the animals that live on land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a split hoof, completely divided, and choose the cud. Now, this is what we call in the Old Testament the laws of clean and unclean meats. And God said that an animal that has a split hoof is completely divided and choose a cud is clean. So therefore, a cow is considered clean according to God's standard. Therefore, a pig is not considered to be clean. I remember it so well. My grandmother, my grandmother's brother, would have been my great uncle, had a heart attack, and when he went to the doctor, the first thing the doctor told him that he would have to do is he would have to give up pork because it was bad for his heart. He didn't say anything about the clean meat, the cow, but he told him that he would have to give up the swine. And so God gave these rules of clean and unclean meats. When it comes to seafood, of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales. Now, what kind of fish are these? These are primarily swimming fish. Fish that live up here, swim around up here. God says fins and scales. Shrimp does not have fins and scales. It lives down here. So everything that falls in the water, all of the other fish who do their business up here, floats down to the bottom, and that's where the shrimp live, and that's what the shrimp eat. And now you know why they're unclean. Lobsters and all of these things that people love to eat. God said they are not clean. Don't eat them. And then of the birds, it says, these are the birds you are to detest and not eat because they are detestable. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite, any kind of black kite, any kind of raven, the horned owl, the screech owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the great owl, the white owl. It continues on there. Primarily, these animals are the ones that are carrion-eating animals or flesh-eating animals. And the animals that aren't that were considered to be clean. So God gave us all of these laws of clean and unclean. Now, today, when I talk about this to people in its modern day, most of them say, well, those laws were done away with. But they were just for the Jews. They were law for Moses, but it doesn't matter today. Well, long before Moses was upon the scene, at the time of Noah's Ark and the flood, God determined what animals should be eaten and what should not be eaten. And he called the ones that could be eaten clean animals, and he sent them into the ark by sevens, and the unclean animals he sent in by twos. Why did he send the clean animals by sevens? Because they were going to eat them. And if they ate the unclean animals, that would have been called extinction, because there wouldn't have been a breeding pair. And so even back to the time of Noah, you have this rule way back there, the clean and unclean. I just told you that. So some people think these are only ancient rules for the ancient people and for the Jews. But I've got to tell you a secret. Jewish stomachs and my stomach is exactly the same. Your stomach too. If it's not good for a Jewish person's arteries and their stomach, it's not good for mine. It's not good for yours. Our bodies are still the same after all of these years, and so 4,000 years later, the same things will clog them up, and God was concerned about our health. And that might be a new idea to you, but here's this text in 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20. It says, "Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You are bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your body." See, God cares about how we take care of our bodies. Why? Because He wants us to give good service to Him. You know, when you're sick and unhealthy, it's hard to be helping other people. But when we're healthy and vibrant, then God can send us about His errands to do His business. He also told us, we have this text in 3 John 2. "Dear friend, I pray that you may enjoy good health, and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along well." One other translation says, "I want you to prosper and be in good health." God cares about our health. That's why He wants us to follow those laws that He placed in the Old Testament. They're still relevant today because He wants us to be in good health, and He wants us to not have those diseases of the Egyptians. Well, I'm going to tell you just for a few minutes about what Seventh-day Adventists believe about a lifestyle. Now, this is not going from telling you about mummies to a commercial for the Adventist church, but this is significant. So I want to tell you about the way that Seventh-day Adventists have tried to apply the laws that God has given us. Seventh-day Adventist lifestyle. Obey clean and unclean meats. So it's a typical Adventist lifestyle. Adventists are non-alcoholic beverage drinkers. We believe the Bible talks and discourages us from drinking alcoholic beverages. Adventists are not smokers. Many Adventists, and I wouldn't tell you all of us, but they're careful in the use of drugs, even in over-the-counter medication. So Adventists tend to try to take less medications than other people. Try to limit intake of too much refined foods and sugars. Seventh-day Adventists try to be caffeine-free for the most part. We believe that not all of us practice it as well as we might. Limit the use of animal products like cheese, eggs, and milk. Adventists know the benefits of exercise. And Seventh-day Adventists have been talking about the benefits of exercise, such as a brisk walk, for over 100 years. Here's just an example of that. This is from the writings of a woman named Ellen White, who was a reformer back in the early 1900s. She says, "Here's a suggestion for all whose work is sedentary and chiefly mental. Let those who have sufficient moral courage and self-control try it. At each meal, take only 2 or 3 kinds of simple food and eat no more than is required to satisfy hunger. Take active exercise every day and see if you do not receive benefit." We have believed as Seventh-day Adventists that this can be helpful, and we believe that for over 100 years. And then the last intangible part about the Seventh-day Adventist lifestyle is that we observe Saturday as a Sabbath, as a day dedicated to God without the task of having to work and make a living. So Seventh-day Adventists practice the Sabbath as a day of rest, and we celebrate Sabbath from Friday night sundown to Saturday night sundown, and so we're in the Sabbath hours now for Seventh-day Adventists. Now, these are things that we believe the Bible leads us to do. Now, what are the benefits of this? What's the payoff? There's a university out in Loma Linda, California, named Loma Linda University. They've done long-term studies. They did something called the Adventist Health Study. We're actually in the middle of Adventist Health Study 2. All the results have not been finished from that, so I'm telling you more about the first one. Long-term studies show that Seventh-day Adventists live 7 years longer than the average population. That's significant. That's very significant. God said, then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. These will be yours for food. We believe that God's original diet in the Garden of Eden was a plant-based diet. And so many Seventh-day Adventists have become vegetarian, no flesh foods at all. Some still drink milk and use limited eggs, but others have become vegan, no animal products whatsoever. And you will hear this word plant-based diet. It was kind of made popular by Bill Clinton a few years, many years ago now, 10 or 12 years ago now, when he was stopping at McDonald's every day when he was jogging, which always seemed kind of funny, you know. You jog to lose weight and then you go to McDonald's. And so anyway, he began to espouse a plant-based diet, and it's all the rage now. Anyone heard of the Impossible Burger? Have you tried the Impossible Burger? Yes. I've tried it. It was okay, but haven't eaten meat for 40 years. So I like grillers just as well. But there's a lot of talk now about a plant-based diet. And in the health study, the Adventist health study, those who were living basically a plant-based diet were living 14 years longer than the general population. Some of you might have heard of blue zones. Have you heard of blue zones? Blue zones are where people live to be really, really old. And one of them is in the United States here in a place called Loma Linda, California. There are more centenarians in Loma Linda, California than any other place in the United States. And it's primarily a Seventh-day Adventist community. And we have all of these old people who have lived this lifestyle for so many years, and it has paid off. And so God knew what he was talking about. He knew that if we live a certain lifestyle, it will kill us. But if we listen to his instructions, that we could live prosperous lives. Even Daniel knew this. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. And so what did Daniel eat? He primarily ate, the King James has this interesting word, pulse. That doesn't sound appetizing to me. But basically, he was eating a vegetarian diet. He was eating plants and vegetables and fruits. And at the end of a test of him and his three friends, it says Nebuchadnezzar found him and his three friends to be wiser than 10 times wiser than all the other wise men. So living according to God's plan for our lives in health pays rich dividends. 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. Whatever you eat, whatever you drink, do it to the glory of God. Well, what if you're not that healthy? What if you're not listening to God's plans? Well, here's something you can learn. You can have a new start. A new start. New start means nutrition. Be careful about your nutrition. Exercise, water, sunlight, temperance, air, rest. trust in divine power. You can put these ideas, these principles in action in your life, and it will pay you rich dividends. Tonight, as you leave, in addition to the outline, which has all this information on it, I'm going to give you a special issue of something called Signs of the Times, and it has something that says 8 Secrets to Better Health. This is an excellent magazine. I think you'll find it very, very helpful. So, the choice is up to you. You can either look like this, or like this. And that is my wife, yes. I know I embarrass her when I show this picture. It's a few years old, but healthy and vibrant. This is what I recommend to you. Let me pray with you as we close. Dear God, I know that you care about us so much, that you don't just care about the big things like getting us to heaven, but you want our lives here to be prosperous. You want our lives here to be healthy. You want our lives here to be the very best that they can be, so that you can use us to do your work. So Lord, as we've gone through this material pretty quickly tonight, I pray that you would help each one of us think about in our lives what we need to do to bring our lifestyles into line with what your biblical teachings are. I know it's not easy, it's hard, but I believe we can do it with your help. Thank you so much. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, let's have our drawing. Where's our drawing pot? Tomorrow night's lecture is entitled The Truth About the Shroud of Turin. Many people have questions about it. Tomorrow night, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you its history. I'm going to tell you kind of step by step what they've done to test it and give you some implications of that information, and then challenge the question of whether it really matters. So we have here another oil lamp. I'm not even sure. There we go. It's a nice, it's got a little bit of a design on it here. And so we're going to give it to someone right now. And I got down to the bottom, and I'm just going to read the name, because I'm not sure why it has a name on it, but I'm just going to read the name. Ryan F. There we go. Good. The beginning of your collection.
Thank you.
The Ryan collection.
Thank you.
You might let him use it too. Have it. Good. I'm sorry tonight's lecture is just a little bit longer than most of them. It's a lot of material to get through, so I appreciate you being here so much. Tomorrow night, 6:30 again, so we'll see you. If you wanted to come and visit us tomorrow morning at worship, we have worship at 10:50 here in this church auditorium. Some of you have met Pastor Anastasia, our children and youth pastor, and she's preaching a sermon tomorrow entitled Worth the Wait. And it's about the healing at the pool of Bethesda. And so I think you would enjoy being here. And then if you want to come and join us tomorrow, we also have a meal afterwards that we would invite you to. It's a vegetarian meal that we have each week. And you'd be, as our guests, you'd be welcome to come and stay for that. So thank you so much. I'll be at the back door if you have any questions.